There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean Breathes Books. Welcome back to my channel and another episode of Zooming In, an occasional series where I engage with bookish social luminaries the world over. And boy, I'm going far afield today, where all the brainiacs and wonderful people immersed in literature live, to Nairobi to chat with Nyambura about a bookish article that we have selected. And so first, before I tell you what that article is, I want to say, hello, Nyambura. Thanks for joining us.
I really enjoyed this article, so I can't wait to talk about it with you.
The article is from in the preparatory chat. Before we turned the recorder on, I realized I know nothing about literature. I don't know anything about culture in my own country compared to Nyambura. They are just a font of information. And my go-to person for all those topics is if I need to know anything about Canadian literature or culture, I know who to ask. They were well aware of this online literary journal. I'd never heard of it. It's called Hazlitt, published by Penguin. It's not just promoting their own books, I don't think. So this is an article by a Canadian writer named Carly Baker, and the title is Against Redemption. And the subtitle or whatever is Social Media is Filled with Documentation of Human Suffering. So why read a tragic novel? Carly Baker, I'd never heard of her. I read somewhere she's like Icelandic Métis. There it is in her Wikipedia. Carly Baker is a Canadian writer of Métis and Icelandic background, which just sounds absolutely fascinating. So I want to read her debut short story collection, Bad Endings, which came out, I think, in 2017. So she's the author of this article, giving you the title, and you have a vague idea of what it's about. I'm just going to ask Nyambura to get us started by telling us what they thought. Take it away, Nyambura.
Well, as a person who has spent too much time on the internet and created a whole different Twitter account just so that I would stop ingesting all of the bad stuff that's happening in the world, but it still seeps through. I totally get her argument, which is there's something about books and the way they present tragedy, versus the way social media hits you with just everything in one swift fell. And I mean, anyone who's paying attention to anything in the world right now, we don't even need to list all of the things that are happening. Pick a region and something is happening. There is something almost closed off in that moment of reading fiction, for instance, that can feel like a balm. Even though you're reading sad stuff, this resonated with me. That's the reason I picked it when you asked me what I'd like to read. This really resonates, especially in this time.
Absolutely. And I guess I doom scroll.
Who among us doesn't?
That's right. And I'm one of those people. I think you are too, Nyambura, still on Twitter. Why are we still on Twitter? It's becoming so politically incorrect to even admit that in public. But there's still such a rich discourse there. I just have to say that isn't being transposed anywhere else that I've been able to find. But anyway, I have a mixture of political and literary stuff, so it's not all doom scrolling. To me, it's like apples and oranges compared to books. And Carly Baker, she's talking about fiction. I transpose that to literary fiction in my own mind, but that isn't necessarily the case. It can be other kinds of fiction, but I just think that is a completely different kettle of fish.
I think you're right. And today I sound like I've just come from improv theater. There is something, I think she talks about empathy in the article, how this builds empathy and all of those things. But I also feel like those two sometimes are not too far apart. For me, at least from the way I read it, but also in my experience, sometimes fiction is a way to help you think through the real world, quote unquote. I'm thinking here, for instance, of the fact that I was reading today that the stuff that's happening in the Middle East has caused so much climate disaster, and it's in terms of emissions and all of that stuff. And there is something about, I think it's called climate fiction or something like
Yes.
that, you know, that particular genre and the way it tackles. There's a book I read because of your channel, one of the first book chats actually, that was about climate fiction set in England. I'll text you the title afterwards. I think about that book when I see conversations around climate change and a future in which they're climate refugees and all of those things. Empathy building is maybe what she's going at, that we don't have that sense of completion when we are seeing these things happening in real time, but books offer us a chance to see these possibilities and what could come of it. Watching the news can be so heartbreaking and unsatisfactory sometimes. It's like, okay, so XYZ happened. And then what? Books sort of answer the end, then what? I feel is part of the argument.
Oh, absolutely. So I'm going to revise your beginning response to my comment. You said
Go on.
yes, and I want to
Uh-huh.
change that to maybe, and
Mm-hmm.
because what
Mm-hmm.
you said is much more on point than whatever I was trying to say. There is absolutely a resonance and interplay between consuming the news and reading fiction. Absolutely. And I thought you were going to actually mention the novel that I am reading. I'm on the last 100 pages of what will probably be, and this episode will go out much later than after I finish it, but what will probably be my book of the year, which
Mm-hmm.
is Fly-Fi, the work of literary fiction about climate change 20 to 30 years into the future. It's called The Deluge by Stephen Markley, an American novelist, and it is a stunning work of literature. And it's, in a sense, it's very depressing, extrapolating for what's happening or not, and even more importantly, not happening now in combating climate change, and extrapolating that into the future with seven-dimensional characters that just jump off the page, and this political world and social technological activist all reacting or not reacting, intervening or not intervening, taking that on a 20-year story. It is absolutely incredible. And I am now viewing every climate related news story through this novel and will for the rest of my days until climate change pushes me to
Off
the
this
seat,
mortal
whatever.
plane.
Yes.
I know. Clivey, yes. And it's interesting to mention the deluge because I have it on my TBR. I think Lindy mentioned it. I'm not too sure.
I think that would have been me or Heidi of my reading life. She and I are buddy reading it.
Yes. It was a Canadian.
I don't think Lindy's read it, or I've never heard her talk about it. As I was reading Carly Baker's article, I was thinking primarily of my experience with this book, The Deluge,
Mhm.
because it really is framing how I'm experiencing, how my doom scroll, my reaction to my doom scrolling, all the terrible things happening climate-wise in the world,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
the inaction of the people that could effect change.
Do you find a book helps you frame or reframe events? I know
Yes.
you're the questioner and I'm supposed to be the answerer, but yeah.
No, no, absolutely not. This is just conversation. I don't think that often because of the kind of books I choose, but I don't know that I would have chosen this book because I would have thought, like a lot of people who react to me raving about it on my channel, their comments are, it sounds a little too externally focused on an issue. I don't know if that's what I want to read. That's the rationale with which I would have passed it over, except I
Mm-hmm.
read Stephen Markley's previous novel, which had no specific social political issue that was exploring through fiction, and it
Mm-hmm.
blew me out of the water. So that's why I wanted to read it. It's even better than Ohio, his last novel. I will probably have given it a full review before this chat goes live. So yeah, that's informed how I experience the news. But taking a step back, I have always been drawn to serious fiction about heavy topics. I'd sometimes like comedic stuff, like I like Barbara Pym, and I think that underneath her comedy, she is exploring some very serious issues around gender and loneliness. But for the most part, I want heavy, depressing stuff to be in my fictions, and I've always been that way. So on that level, this article really spoke to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
That's interesting. This is a total aside, but I've never read Barbara Pym.
give Barbara Pym a try someday.
Where should
Not
I
much.
start?
I would start with her debut, Some Tame Gazelle.
Okay.
Yeah, That's probably her best. I've got four favorites, and that's one of them. She started writing it when she was a university student in the 1930s or something, and
Uh-huh.
she projected into the future. She didn't think she would ever marry, and she didn't think her sister would ever marry, and it was about them as late middle-aged spinsters in a parochial parish town. That's actually what happened. Although her sister was a divorcee, she envisioned all this, and it's marvelous, absolutely marvelous.
We have a prophetess in our hands.
That's right. Oh, let me see if there was anything. There was a couple quotes. Here's a short excerpt from the article. A
Mm-hmm.
successful tragic novel is subversive. It's about the journey, not the destination
Mm-hmm.
exercise. Although both journey and destination are grim, the details must still crackle with the larger than life quality we look for when escaping into a narrative. And yes, sorrow can be sweet. William Shakespeare's Juliet knew what was up. I like that passage, and that speaks to me as somebody who is always drawn to literature that typically has an unhappy ending.
We know this. For me, the thing that stood out was her comparison to Fallout, which is a game I've played. I'm outing myself as a gamer.
I
It
didn't
was
think you
very,
had any more outings left to perform.
and it was that bit of intertextuality was interesting because there is a way in which, for instance, like games increasingly are being spoken about in the same way literature is. And I don't just mean reviews and so on, but also we go to games for escape, we go to games for escape. But what else can be derived from gaming? Part of it, as she points out, is that games encounter tragedy and like horrific events in a very different way from the way literature does, even though they are texts, in the classic people who have MFAs, and there's been a lot of MFA discussed recently, but like they are texts in similar ways. But she points out they encounter these things in different ways, the way anybody taking in these texts will deal with the ideas that come with encountering those texts. So that was interesting for me. But yeah, overall, many things to think about from this article. Thank you for sharing it with me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And there is one more key point that resonated. There's a personal benefit in sitting with a tragic story for a prolonged time. And that's exactly my experience of reading The Deluge. It's a 900-page novel, and I've been reading
Whoa.
it for close to 3 months, 50 or 60 pages a week. And that's very different from doom scrolling. Most of the time when I doom scroll, I don't even click on the link to read the article. I just read the headline on Twitter, and that all kind of works its way into my consciousness, but I'm not really sitting with anything. And
Mm-hmm.
literary
Mm-hmm.
fiction, I'm using the word literary, you don't have to put that adjective on it, but sitting with a big story, fictional story about something that's socially, politically relevant and doesn't have a happy ending, I think is a worthwhile exercise.
I totally agree.
Let's end on this note, if I'm not putting you on the spot. What would be a
Mm-hmm.
book like this that you are reading, have recently read, or want to read soon?
A book like Deluge?
Or it doesn't have to be sci-fi, but a book that's kind of tragic.
Oh, I don't know about tragic, but it has some tragic elements, and it's nonfiction actually. I'm currently reading a YA book on the history of labor in the US. It's called Shift Happens, and very clever title. It's aimed at kids. There are many instances where labor is, pushed back by capital in the US. I mean, that's not so hard to believe because anybody who's seen the news, I don't know if you saw this, but Amazon gave its factory workers a thank you package with little pithy lines. It was a bit like, people are dying, Kim. I don't know if you know the reference I'm making, but people are dying,
Go.
Kim. Why are you giving them sweets? Let's be serious. And a huge part of that, of course, is that in the US, labor is not organized for a host of reasons. The book can feel pretty sad, to be honest. Like the times when I'd just be sitting in a matatu. For the non-Kenyans, a matatu is public transport, and I'd be close to tears because it's like every two chapters someone dies. Like, what's going on? But also it has felt very hopeful in strange ways because I'm in a lot of organizing spaces in this city, and a lot has been happening in Kenya, and it's easy to feel hopeless. But when you're reading a book like this, where it's like, every 10 steps forward, you get 9 steps back. You keep remembering that one step. It's been wonderful for that reason.
I've been talking to Heidi about how I think this book is going to end. I don't think it's going to have a happy ending, but I'm expecting there to be a glimmer of hope.
Hmm.
All I need is a glimmer.
No, a win is a win. A win is a win.
And I appreciate glimmers of hope when as the reader, I'm put through my paces, put through my tragic, sad paces for that hard won glimmer of hope. That's a
Yeah,
very
they feel well
satisfying
earned.
read for me.
Mhm.
Yes. I'll just say very quickly, Nyambura and I recorded a chat for my Bite-Sized Bit Chats series about a novel by a Sudanese American writer. The novel is set in South Sudan, and it sounds fascinating and not a happy story. So this chat and that chat resonate. So if that one has gone live before this one, the link will be in the show notes because they should really be watched together. Nyambura, always a pleasure.
Thank you. This was a delight.
The complete opposite of a doom scroll.
I enjoyed every moment.
Thank you.